The exploding graveyard of Paris. When we think of Paris, we picture the city of light. We think of romance, fresh pastries, the glow of the Eiffel Tower, and couples walking hand in hand down cobblestone streets. But beneath the beautiful, manicured streets of the French capital lies a terrifying secret. A secret born out of necessity and overwhelming horror. If you go to Paris today and visit the catacombs, you will walk through winding tunnels lined with the carefully stacked skulls and bones of 6 million people. It is the largest underground necropolis on Earth. But have you ever asked yourself why those bones are down there? They aren't there because of an ancient ritual. They aren't there because of a plague. They are there because in the spring of 1780, the dead simply refused to stay buried. They are there because a graveyard exploded. Our story takes us back to the Middle Ages, right into the bustling, dirty heart of central Paris. Here stood the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents. For nearly 10 centuries, this single plot of land was the primary burial ground for the city's poor. But there was a fatal flaw in the city's design. The cemetery was trapped in the dead center of Paris, completely surrounded by housing, taverns, and the city's massive central food market, Les Halles. Paris was growing rapidly, but the cemetery couldn't. Because space was so limited, the poor were not given individual graves. Instead, they were dumped into what the French called fosses communes, massive gaping pits dug deep into the earth. A single pit could hold up to 1,500 bodies. When a pit was finally full, gravediggers would throw a few inches of dirt on top, take a few steps to the left, and start digging the next one. When the cemetery was totally full, the gravediggers would simply exhume the oldest pits. They dug up the decaying bones, packed them into open-air galleries called charnel houses, built into the cemetery walls, and threw fresh corpses into the newly emptied dirt. Over 10 centuries, an estimated 2 million bodies were packed into this single small square of land. The earth literally could not digest the dead fast enough. By the 18th century, the ground of the cemetery was so saturated with human remains that it had physically swelled. The dirt of the graveyard was now piled more than 2 meters, over 6 feet, higher than the streets outside its walls. It was a bloated, rotting sponge of earth and bone. The stench was legendary. Perfume vendors flocked to the surrounding streets, making a fortune selling scented handkerchiefs just so people could breathe. Locals claimed the fumes from the graveyard could turn wine sour, curdle milk, and rot the meat in the neighboring food market. But the church refused to close the cemetery. The burial fees were just too profitable. Nature, however, had other plans. In the early spring of 1780, Paris experienced weeks of heavy, unrelenting rain. Day after day, the water poured down, soaking into the 6-foot-high mound of corpse-filled dirt. The bloated cemetery acted like a sponge, absorbing thousands of gallons of water. Beneath the surface, the pressure inside the mass graves was building to a catastrophic level. Right next to the cemetery wall sat a row of buildings. Among them was a tavern and restaurant on the Rue de la Lingerie. Late one night, as the rain hammered against the windows, the tavern owner and his patrons heard a terrifying sound. It was coming from the basement, a deep, agonizing groan of stone under impossible pressure. And then, a deafening crash. The retaining wall separating the cemetery from the tavern had violently ruptured. The tavern owner grabbed a lantern, walked over to the basement door, and slowly descended the stairs. What the flickering light of his lantern revealed was a scene straight out of hell. His cellar was completely flooded. But it wasn't just mud and rainwater. The basement was filled waist-deep with a sludge of rotting flesh, hundreds of splintered bones, and decaying corpses. Even worse, because the mass graves lacked oxygen, many of the bodies had undergone a grotesque chemical transformation. The human fat of the corpses had turned into a thick, putrid, soap-like substance known as adipocere, corpse wax. The tavern's cellar was coated in it. The dead had literally broken down the walls to reclaim the living world. The cellar explosion was the breaking point. The public outcry was so fierce and the health hazard so undeniable that King Louis XVI's government ordered the Cemetery of the Innocents closed immediately. But closing the gates didn't solve the problem of the 2 million bodies rotting above street level. The city needed a massive, permanent solution. Beneath the streets of Paris lay miles of ancient, abandoned limestone quarries. The city engineers realized these deep, cold tunnels were the perfect place to hide their shameful, rotting secret. Starting in 1786, an incredible and macabre operation began. Every single night at dusk, carts draped in heavy black cloth would line up at the cemetery gates. By torchlight, gravediggers shoveled thousands of bones out of the earth and loaded them into the wagons. Then, accompanied by priests holding lanterns and chanting the office of the dead, this grim parade would roll slowly across Paris. They dumped the bones down deep mine shafts, where workers below would meticulously stack them into decorative walls. This nocturnal procession of the dead continued every single night, for 2 entire years. By 1788, the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents was finally empty. The site was paved over and transformed into a public herb and vegetable market. Today, if you travel to the first arrondissement of Paris, you can visit the square Joachim du Bellay. It is a lovely, peaceful plaza with a beautiful Renaissance fountain in the center. People sit on benches, sip espresso, and enjoy the Parisian sunshine. Almost none of them realize that they are drinking coffee in the exact spot where 2 million corpses once rested. But the dead of the innocents aren't truly gone. They are still there, deep underground, lining the dark, dripping walls of the Paris Catacombs, a permanent monument to the time Paris ran out of room and the dead came bursting through the walls.